At 76, one of Hollywood's most iconic leading men lives in absolute exile, not in disgrace, not in failure, but entirely by choice. This is a man who made the world fall in love with a pretty woman, who commanded screens for decades as the ultimate embodiment of charm and desire, a global sex symbol who could have had absolutely anything. And yet today, he is essentially banned from the world's largest market, estranged from the industry that made him a superstar, and living a quiet life in the streets of Madrid with 2 toddlers. But here is what makes this story truly shocking. He orchestrated his own exile. While other actors chased billion-dollar franchises and bowed to studio demands, this man walked away. He chose a Tibetan monk's advice over a movie mogul's money. He traded red carpets for refugee camps. And when the industry told him to stay silent or lose everything, he spoke louder. The cost was astronomical. Hollywood essentially erased him. Major studios stopped calling. Blockbuster roles vanished overnight. An entire superpower banned his name. And at 73, while raising infant sons, his body nearly gave out completely, forcing him to face the terrifying mathematics of his own mortality. Yet somehow, in this complete exile, he discovered something Hollywood never offered: peace. How does a restless kid from a small town of 5,000 people become one of the biggest stars on the planet? Why would someone choose principle over profit when the price is total erasure? And how do you find your true purpose when the very system that built you tries to bury you for speaking the truth? Before we answer these questions, we need to go back to the beginning, because the man who would eventually reject Hollywood's throne was searching for something else entirely, long before fame ever found him. The Methodist boy, the empty canvas, and the search for silence. There's a profound, almost invisible restlessness that haunts certain individuals from the very moment they are born. It is an aching, unexplainable void that cannot be filled by ordinary success, suburban comfort, or the traditional American dream. Most people learn to ignore the noise. They quiet the questions, get a safe job, and settle into predictable rhythm of life. But Richard Gere was entirely incapable of ignoring the noise. Born Richard Tiffany Gere on August 31st, 1949, in Philadelphia, his true childhood unfolded in the quiet, snow-covered streets of Syracuse, New York. It was a modest, ordinary town of barely 5,000 people, featuring just a single movie theater ironically named the Hollywood. It was a remarkably conventional place to incubate a remarkably unconventional soul. His father, Homer George Gere, was an insurance agent by trade, but to people of Syracuse, he was infinitely more than a man who sold policies. Homer had once harbored a deep, burning dream of becoming a Methodist minister, and although he never officially wore the clerical collar, he carried the sacred weight of that calling into every single interaction of his life. When neighbors faced sudden tragedies or financial ruin, they didn't call the city authorities. They called Homer Gere. He sold insurance with the fierce, protective devotion of a man trying to save human souls. "I grew up in a Methodist house with deeply compassionate people," Richard would later reflect, describing the profound moral foundation his parents laid for him. His mother, Doris, was a homemaker who filled their modest, crowded house with a symphony of music and uncompromising warmth. Richard was the second of 5 children, the eldest son. From a very early age, it was glaringly obvious that he possessed an almost terrifying abundance of natural talent. The Gere household was intensely musical, and Richard mastered the piano, the guitar, and the trumpet with effortless grace. He possessed the discipline of an elite athlete, excelling at gymnastics with a physical control that bordered on perfection. At North Syracuse Central High School, he was the golden boy. He was a kid who could deliver a flawless, soaring trumpet solo in the auditorium, and then walk into the gymnasium and execute a physically impossible vault that left his peers in absolute awe. He was brilliant. He was athletic. He was deeply loved. On paper, his life was perfect. But inside the mind of the teenage boy, a quiet, agonizing storm was raging. In 1967, Richard graduated from high school and accepted a gymnastics scholarship to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, but in a decision that must have bewildered the pragmatic, working-class town he left behind, he did not choose to study business, medicine, or law. He chose to study philosophy. While his peers were going to frat parties and preparing for safe, corporate careers, Richard was walking across the freezing Massachusetts campus with Jean-Paul Sartre's dense, existential masterpiece, Being in Nothingness, tucked tightly under his arm. He was a young man desperately trying to dissect the very fabric of human existence. What is reality? Why are we here? What is the actual point of all this motion? For a teenager from Syracuse, these were not abstract, pretentious academic exercises. They were a matter of spiritual survival. Like most young people, I wasn't particularly happy, Richard admitted years later, stripping away the glamorous illusion of his youth with profound, bleeding honesty. I often asked, what's this all for? The beautiful, compassionate Methodist faith that his father embodied so perfectly somehow did not fit the exact shape of the hole in Richard's chest. It offered community. Yes. It offered morality. Certainly. But it did not answer the terrifying, burning questions about the nature of the ego and the suffocating noise inside his own head. So he searched. He devoured everything he could find. He studied Bishop Berkeley's subjective idealism. He read The Crack in the Cosmic Egg. He was looking for a key to unlock the prison of his own mind. And then in his early 20s, the restless, searching American boy collided with the ancient, profound stillness of the East. He discovered Zen Buddhism. He began studying under Kyozen Joshu Sasaki, a rigorous, uncompromising Zen master. For a young man overflowing with kinetic energy and existential dread, the practice of sitting in absolute, agonizing stillness was a revelation. Richard locked himself inside a cramped, suffocating New York apartment for months at a time. He performed Tai Chi. He sat on a cushion, staring at a blank wall, desperately trying to starve the ego and quiet the relentless, deafening machinery of his own thoughts. I was holed up in my apartment for months, he later remembered, describing his intense, isolated pursuit of enlightenment. Just doing my best to do sitting practice. I had a very clear feeling that I'd always been in meditation, that I'd never left meditation. It was a profound, life-altering epiphany. He had finally found his home. But as his spirit began to settle, his tolerance for the artificial, structured cage of university education completely evaporated. After 2 years of studying philosophy, Richard made a decision that would permanently sever his ties to a normal life. He dropped out of college. He had no degree. He had no financial safety net. He had absolutely no practical backup plan. He only possessed a deeply disciplined physical body, a mind trained in Zen meditation, and a sudden, burning compulsion to express the complexities of human emotion on a stage. His father, Homer, must have been completely bewildered. The son with a gymnastics scholarship, the musical prodigy, the boy with infinite promise, was willingly walking away from stability to chase the chaotic, impoverished, and deeply unreliable ghost of the theater. In 1969, Richard moved to New York City and stepped into the gritty, unforgiving wilderness of the acting world. He worked at the Seattle Repertory Theater. He took parts at the Provincetown Playhouse on Cape Cod. His first major professional role was in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, but the word professional was a massive overstatement of his reality. The glamour of his future was entirely absent. He was a starving artist in the truest, most humiliating sense of the word. The man who would one day command $20 million a picture was sleeping in the back seat of his car between acting gigs. He was scraping together loose change just to pay rent for dilapidated apartments, auditioning for absolutely anything that would keep him from starving. He was a Buddhist searching for the dissolution of the ego, attempting to survive in an industry entirely powered by vanity and self-obsession. It was the ultimate dangerous paradox. And as the calendar turned toward the 1970s, that paradox was about to violently explode. The quiet, meditating boy from Syracuse, was about to be thrust onto the global stage, where the world would not care about his mind, his philosophy, or his soul. They were only going to care about his face, his body, and the intoxicating, dangerous illusion of his absolute perfection. The trap was being set, and the reluctant prince was about to walk directly into the golden cage. The paradox of the flesh, the Himalayas, and the American Gigolo. To survive the brutal, unforgiving grind of the New York theater scene in the early 1970s, an actor must possess a thick skin and a desperate, starving ego. But Richard Gere was operating on a completely different, deeply contradictory frequency. He was a man performing under the bright stage lights every night, while secretly, desperately trying to extinguish his own ego during the day. In 1973, his raw, undeniable magnetism finally caught the attention of the industry. He landed a breakthrough role in the original London stage production of the musical Grease. Long before John Travolta ever slicked back his hair and immortalized the character on film, Richard was the original Danny Zuko. He possessed a gritty, dangerous, and overwhelmingly charismatic stage presence. The critics took notice. The audience was captivated, but the applause echoing in the damp, crowded theaters of London did absolutely nothing to quiet the restless, agonizing storm inside his mind. For most young actors, starring in a hit play in London's West End is the ultimate validation. It is the moment they finally breathe, embrace the vanity, and enjoy the intoxicating fruits of their labor. But for Richard, the applause felt incredibly hollow. The Stanislavski acting method, which demands that an actor dig deep into their own psyche to manufacture, sustain, and project intense human emotions like anger, hatred, and extreme sorrow, began to feel fundamentally, spiritually wrong to him. Why would a man spend his entire life trying to artificially manufacture the very suffering he was meditating to escape? In 1978, driven by a profound, burning existential hunger that no script could ever satisfy, Richard made a decision that would permanently alter the trajectory of his soul and eventually cost him his Hollywood empire. He left the theaters, the audition rooms, and the flashing lights behind, and traveled to Nepal with the Brazilian painter Sylvia Martins. Imagine the breathtaking, sensory contrast of this journey. The young actor from Syracuse, New York, stepped out of the cynical, hyper-competitive machinery of the Western world and found himself standing in the freezing, absolute, and ancient shadow of the Himalayas. There, among the majestic, silent peaks, he met Tibetan monks and lamas who spoke a language his searching soul instantly recognized. He immersed himself in the teachings of the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism. He wasn't acting. He wasn't researching a role. He walked across the rugged, high-altitude terrain as a genuine pilgrim. And then the ultimate, life-defining encounter occurred. He met the Dalai Lama. That meeting changed my life, Richard would quietly confess decades later, stripped of all Hollywood pretense. During their conversation, Richard tried to explain the complexities of his profession. He tried to explain the emotional labor of acting, of intentionally creating anger and sadness for a performance. The spiritual leader looked at the handsome, troubled American actor and gently, beautifully challenged everything Richard had ever learned. The Dalai Lama simply laughed. He laughed at the sheer absurdity of the idea. Why would anyone willingly work so incredibly hard to manufacture negative emotions? Why invite artificial suffering into a mind that is supposed to be searching for absolute peace? In the echoing resonance of that laugh, the boy from a Methodist household, descended from the original Mayflower Pilgrims, finally found his true, permanent lineage. He fully committed himself to Tibetan Buddhism. He dedicated his life to the pursuit of compassion, the dissolution of the ego, and the detachment from material desire. He had finally found a profound, untouchable silence. But the universe possesses a terrifying, almost cruel sense of irony. Just as Richard Gere was successfully learning how to extinguish his ego and detach himself from the superficial desires of the flesh, the ruthless, billion-dollar machinery of Hollywood decided it was time to turn his flesh into a global commodity. The silence of the mountains was about to be violently shattered by the deafening roar of the 1980s. Hollywood had come calling. In 1977, Richard delivered an unforgettable, incredibly dark performance in Looking for Mr. Goodbar, playing a troubled, highly toxic hustler in just 15 minutes of screen time. But those 15 minutes burned a permanent hole in the cultural memory of the audience. The following year, in 1978, he starred in Terrence Malick's breathtaking visual masterpiece, Days of Heaven. The critics raved. The studio executives watched the daily footage and realized they were not just looking at a talented actor. They were looking at a gold mine. They were looking at a man who possessed a dangerous, smoldering, and effortless eroticism that simply could not be taught. And then, the definitive thunderbolt struck. In 1980, a film was released that would instantly, permanently, and violently change the entire definition of Richard Gere's existence. The film was American Gigolo. Directed by Paul Schrader, Richard was cast as Julian Kay, a high-end, incredibly expensive male escort navigating the dangerous, glamorous, and morally bankrupt underworld of Los Angeles. The role was electric. It was unapologetic. It was pure, unadulterated visual seduction. When Richard Gere appeared on screen, meticulously dressing himself in custom-tailored Giorgio Armani suits, moving with feline grace that was both deeply masculine and incredibly vulnerable, the world completely lost its mind. American Gigolo didn't just make Richard famous. It made him a phenomenon. He single-handedly ushered in a new era of male vanity. The Armani suits he wore in the film completely redefined men's fashion globally. But more importantly, the film did something that Hollywood rarely does to its leading men. It completely, unapologetically objectified him. It turned him into the absolute, undisputed fantasy of millions of women and men across the globe. I had never seen my name so big on a marquee, Richard remembered, reflecting on the dizzying, terrifying velocity of that specific year. Then 3 of my films opened back to back, and I literally woke up famous. For the older audiences watching this, those who remember exactly where they were when American Gigolo and later An Officer and a Gentleman dominated the cultural zeitgeist, Richard Gere was the absolute pinnacle of desirability. But look incredibly closely at the staggering, almost suffocating psychological paradox of what was actually happening to him. This is the ultimate, heartbreaking irony of Richard Gere's career. Here was a man who woke up every single morning, sat on a cushion in absolute silence, and meditated for hours to achieve spiritual detachment. A man who desperately wanted to transcend the shallow, artificial confines of the human ego. A man whose closest advisor was a Tibetan monk. And the moment he opened his eyes and walked out his front door, he was aggressively swarmed by paparazzi, screaming fans, and studio executives who were making hundreds of millions of dollars selling his physical body to the world. He was literally playing a man who sold his flesh for money in American Gigolo, while a Hollywood studio system was doing the exact same thing to him in reality. He wanted to be a bodhisattva, but the world demanded that he be a sex symbol. It was a collision of 2 entirely incompatible universes. Fame, in its most extreme, aggressive form, is a violent assault on the spirit. It demands that you constantly feed the ego. It demands that you obsess over your appearance, your box office numbers, and your status on the Hollywood hierarchy. For a man actively practicing Tibetan Buddhism, becoming the most desired physical object on the planet was not a blessing. It was a golden, exquisitely tailored, and incredibly suffocating cage. Throughout the early 1980s, the paradox only intensified. In 1982, he starred opposite Deborah Winger in An Officer and a Gentleman. The film was a colossal, earth-shattering success, grossing nearly $130 million and earning multiple Academy Awards. When Richard, dressed in his immaculate, crisp white Navy uniform, walked into that factory and carried his leading lady out into the sunlight, he permanently cemented his status as the ultimate romantic savior in American cinematic history. He was earning millions. He was receiving Golden Globe nominations. He had the entire world wrapped firmly around his finger. But behind the blinding flashbulbs and the deafening screams of the premiere lines, a profound, heavy tension was quietly building inside his soul. The gap between the man he was portraying on screen and the pilgrim who had walked the Himalayas was growing too wide to bridge. The 1980s had made him a king, but the crown was incredibly heavy. And as the decade progressed, Richard Gere was about to realize that if he wanted to save his own soul, he could not simply meditate in silence. He was going to have to speak up. He was going to have to use the massive global megaphone that Hollywood had given him. He was preparing to make a decision that would horrify his agents, infuriate the studio executives, and ultimately trigger the most ruthless, calculated, and devastating industry exile in the modern history of Hollywood. The 1993 Oscars, The Faustian Bargain, and The Price of the Soul. There is a cold, unwritten, and absolute rule that governs the glittering, multi-billion-dollar empire of Hollywood. It is a Faustian bargain that every superstar is eventually asked to sign. The industry will give you unimaginable wealth, global adoration, and your name on marquees around the world. But in exchange, you must never, ever disrupt the flow of the money. You must remain a highly profitable, politically safe illusion. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Richard Gere was standing firmly at the absolute summit of that empire, but a profound, agonizing friction was quietly tearing his dual existence apart. While the studio executives were obsessively tracking his box office receipts, Richard was spending his time completely detached from the Hollywood machinery. He was traveling to the remote, impoverished borders of India and Nepal. He was not staying in five-star hotels. He was sitting in the dust of refugee camps. He was listening with a broken heart to the stories of exiled Tibetans who had fled terrible persecution, leaving their ancient culture and their families behind. He co-founded Tibet House United States in New York. He became a passionate, deeply committed chairman for the International Campaign for Tibet. For Richard, this was not a casual, performative celebrity charity. This was his spiritual lifeline. But for the incredibly powerful, profit-driven executives in Los Angeles, Richard's activism was rapidly becoming a terrifying liability. As the 1990s dawned, the global cinematic landscape was undergoing a massive, unprecedented geopolitical shift. Hollywood was desperately trying to unlock the vast, untapped potential of the Chinese box office, a market that represented billions of dollars in future revenue, production deals, and global distribution rights. The studios were absolutely terrified of angering the Chinese government. And right in the middle of this delicate, highly lucrative international dance stood Richard Gere, one of their biggest, most bankable leading men, loudly and publicly condemning the very government the studios were trying to court. The tension reached an absolute, catastrophic breaking point on the evening of March 29, 1993. It was the night of the 65th Academy Awards. The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles was packed with the most powerful actors, directors, and executives on the planet. An estimated 1 billion people were watching the broadcast live around the globe. Richard Gere was invited to step onto the magnificent stage to present the award for Best Art Direction. The protocol for an Oscar presenter is incredibly simple. You walk out the microphone, you smile your famous smile, you read the light-hearted banner scrolling across the teleprompter, you open the envelope, and you hand over the golden statue. You do your job, and you keep the multi-million-dollar broadcast moving on schedule. But as Richard walked up to the podium, looking out at the sea of diamonds, designer tuxedos, and absolute privilege, the crushing disparity of the world hit him with profound force. He thought about the monks he had meditated with. He thought about the Dalai Lama, who had personally, gently asked him to use his voice to help. Richard stepped up to the microphone. He looked at the teleprompter. And then, in a moment of breathtaking, unscripted defiance, he completely ignored it. He went off script. With a calm, steady, and incredibly deliberate voice, Richard hijacked the world's largest entertainment platform. He spoke directly to the billion people watching, bypassing the triviality of the award ceremony entirely. He began to speak about the horrendous, heartbreaking human rights situation unfolding in Tibet. He used the platform to publicly, explicitly denounce the Chinese government's actions, calling out the oppression and the cultural devastation of a peaceful people. He essentially held the entire Hollywood establishment hostage on live television. Imagine the sheer, absolute panic that must have erupted in the control room of that broadcast. Imagine the blood draining from the faces of the studio executives, sitting in the front rows. They were watching their golden boy, their incredibly profitable sex symbol, actively sabotaging billions of dollars in future international revenue in a matter of 60 seconds. When Richard walked off that stage, he had not just broken the unwritten rule of Hollywood, he had completely, violently shattered the machine. The retaliation from the industry was immediate, ruthless, and absolute. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was furious. They officially, permanently banned Richard Gere from ever presenting at the Oscars again. But the ban from the award show was merely a slap on the wrist compared to the chilling, silent execution of his career that followed. The Chinese government's response was swift. Richard Gere was officially, permanently banned for life from entering China. His films were blacklisted. His name became entirely radioactive in the world's largest emerging market. And Hollywood, an industry that worships courage on the silver screen, but cowers to capital in reality, immediately turned its back on a man who had made them millions. Major studios began quietly, methodically shelving projects that had his name attached. Directors who had begged to work with him suddenly found their funding pulled if they tried to cast him. Producers stopped returning his phone calls. He was completely shut out of the blockbuster ecosystem. He was informed, through polite but devastatingly clear back channels, that if a studio wanted access to the Chinese market, they simply could not afford to put Richard Gere on a movie poster. He was essentially exiled. For the older audiences watching this, especially those who grew up in a generation that valued the uncompromising integrity of standing up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost, this is a moment of profound, majestic heroism. We live in an era where celebrities issue apologies for the slightest offenses to protect their brand sponsorships. But Richard Gere, standing at the absolute zenith of his power, looked at the throne of Hollywood, and he willingly walked away. He sacrificed his empire for soul. Years later, reflecting on the brutal, career-altering consequences of his activism, Richard was asked if he had any regrets about the night he burned his mainstream career to the ground. He responded with the quiet, unwavering certainty of a man who has achieved absolute spiritual clarity. "I don't regret it for a second," he said flatly, stripped of all Hollywood pretense. "The Dalai Lama asked me to help. They need help. And that is infinitely more important than any movie role. That is infinitely more important than any movie role." Listen to profound, untouchable peace in that statement. He had achieved the ultimate liberation. By choosing his principles over his profit, Richard Gere had broken out of the golden cage. He was no longer a commodity to be bought and sold by the studio system. He was a free man. The exile, however, was not the end of his artistic life. Shut out of the massive, studio-funded blockbusters, Richard was forced to pivot toward the quieter, grittier world of independent cinema. And in a beautiful, poetic twist of fate, it was exactly in this marginalized space that he would eventually deliver the absolute best, most complex, and deeply rewarding acting performances of his entire life. But the incredible courage he displayed on the public stage was about to clash violently with the intimate, fragile dynamics of his private life. As the 1990s roared on, Richard found himself attempting to navigate a profoundly complicated personal landscape. He was a man who lived with one foot firmly planted in the sacred, silent teachings of Tibetan Buddhism, and the other foot desperately trying to maintain the beautiful, chaotic, and highly publicized reality of a high-profile Hollywood romance. He was about to enter into one of the most famous, visually stunning, and ultimately heartbreaking marriages of the decade. And the man who had just successfully fought an entire global superpower for the sake of his soul was about to discover that fighting for the survival of marriage requires a completely different and infinitely more agonizing kind of surrender. The foil rings, the supermodel, and the hollow fairy tale. There is a tragic, inescapable paradox that haunts men who seek spiritual enlightenment while living in the blinding center of the material world. When a man spends hours every morning sitting in silent meditation, trying desperately to detach himself from the ego and the illusions of the flesh, he eventually realizes that the outside world is not meditating with him. By the late 1980s, Richard Gere was a man deeply fractured by his own existence. He was a devout Tibetan Buddhist who despised the superficiality of Hollywood, yet he was internationally worshipped as the ultimate untouchable symbol of male sexuality. He was incredibly lonely. He was looking for an anchor in a world made entirely of smoke. And in 1988, at a backyard barbecue hosted by the legendary celebrity photographer Herb Ritts, the smoke parted, and Richard collided with a woman who was practically glowing with youth and promise. Her name was Cindy Crawford. She was 22 years old. She was not just a model. She was rapidly becoming the absolute face of the coming decade, a rising superstar with voluminous brown hair, a breathtaking athletic beauty, and a trademark smile that could stop traffic in any city on earth. Richard was 39. He was a Hollywood veteran, heavily bruised by the industry, carrying the deep existential weight of a man who spent his time consulting with Tibetan monks. Despite the massive 17-year age gap, the chemistry between them was an instant, electric explosion. To the outside world, they were the absolute, undisputed power couple of the early 1990s. They were a breathtaking collision of Hollywood royalty and fashion supremacy. They traveled to India together. They meditated side by side in the Himalayas. Photographs of them walking red carpets, holding hands, looking like two flawless deities descended from Mount Olympus, sold millions of magazines globally. But behind the flawlessly manicured image, invisible, microscopic cracks were already beginning to form in the foundation of their sanctuary. When you are 22 years old and you fall madly in love with a 39-year-old cinematic icon who possesses an established, deeply intense spiritual worldview, a very specific, dangerous psychological dynamic begins to take shape. You do not just love the man. You mold yourself around his gravity. Decades later, looking back at the doomed architecture of their relationship with the profound clarity of a mature woman, Cindy delivered a quote that strikes at the absolute heart of why age gap marriages so frequently fail. In the beginning, when you're a young woman, you're like baseball? I like baseball. You're really into Tibetan Buddhism? I'll try that, she recalled, exposing the innocent, eager desperation of her youth. You're willing to kind of mold yourself around whoever you're in love with. You're willing to mold yourself. Listen to the terrifying reality of that admission. Cindy was not building her own identity. She was simply borrowing Richard's. Richard, for his part, was older, fiercely established in his beliefs, and entirely inflexible. He had spent years defining himself completely outside of Hollywood's expectations, and he viewed traditional marriage as just another societal cage. But Cindy was deeply in love, and she was growing incredibly restless waiting for him to commit. According to reports, she finally delivered an absolute ultimatum. This woman who I was crazy about and loved very much said, "I can't wait. I got to move on if it ain't happening." Richard quietly admitted years later. Faced with the terrifying prospect of losing her, the Buddhist who feared the cage finally surrendered. In December of 1991, Richard and Cindy did not throw a lavish, multi-million-dollar celebrity wedding. They did something incredibly impulsive. They eloped. They flew on a private jet to Las Vegas, walked into the little Church of the West, and exchanged vows. They didn't even have actual wedding rings. They fashioned makeshift rings out of aluminum foil. Afterward, they celebrated their union by eating dinner at a local Denny's diner. It was meant to be wildly romantic. It was meant to be wonderfully spontaneous and real. Instead, it was the exact moment the hourglass was flipped over. It was the beginning of the end. The tabloids, sensing the inherent instability of an aging, deeply spiritual actor marrying a 25-year-old supermodel, completely lost their minds. The media hunted them ruthlessly. Insidious, malicious rumors began to swirl across the globe. The tabloids published wildly fabricated stories claiming that their marriage was a complete sham, a highly orchestrated, cynical publicity stunt designed to hide their true sexualities from the public. The whispers grew so deafening, and the pressure became so absolutely unbearable, that in May of 1994, Richard and Cindy did something almost unprecedented in the history of modern celebrity crisis management. They took out a full-page advertisement in the Times of London, spending tens of thousands of dollars simply to defend the validity of their love. The statement read, "We got married because we love each other and we decided to make a life together. We are heterosexual and monogamous and take our commitment to each other very seriously. There is not and never has been a prenuptial agreement of any kind. Reports of a divorce are totally false." For the audiences watching at home, especially those who understand that true love never requires a megaphone, this was a moment of profound, agonizing absurdity. The statement backfired spectacularly. In the ruthless, cynical arena of public opinion, taking out a full-page ad in a newspaper to declare that your marriage is fine is the ultimate, undeniable proof that your marriage is actually falling apart. If everything was solid, why were they protesting so incredibly loudly? Why did a man who supposedly practiced Zen detachment care so deeply about what British tabloids were whispering? Because the golden cage was suffocating them both. By December of 1994, just 6 months after publishing that desperate, absurd defense of their love, their publicist released a brief, cold statement announcing their separation. The Fairytale had lasted exactly 4 years. The post-mortem of their marriage reveals a tragedy, not betrayal, but simple, inescapable human growth. "We didn't spend enough time together," Cindy told People magazine shortly after the split. "We thought it would be okay if we just flew in from Paris to Los Angeles to get together for a night to see each other. It wasn't. But the geographical distance was merely a symptom of the fatal disease. The deeper, unfixable issue was a fundamental power imbalance of their age gap. Cindy was no longer the eager, 22-year-old girl willing to quietly meditate in the Himalayas. She was approaching her 30s. She had become an immensely powerful, independent global businesswoman in her own right. I think part of the problem was that we were a lot of other things, but I don't know if we were ever friends like peers," Cindy admitted on a podcast decades later, delivering a devastatingly honest autopsy of their union. "Because I was young and he was Richard Gere." She described how the dynamic fundamentally broke when she found her own voice. Your 20s for women is such a time where you're starting to come into your own and feel your own power, she explained. And it's hard to change in a relationship because what one person might have signed up for, all of a sudden, you're not that anymore. Richard had wanted a woman who would softly, quietly follow him on his spiritual path. Cindy had grown into a woman who desperately needed to lead her own life. The divorce was finalized in 1995. They divided their assets. They removed the aluminum foil rings. They walked away from the wreckage, remaining polite, respectful, but entirely distant. "We're friendly," Cindy noted years later, offering a chillingly sad epilogue to the greatest romance of the early 90s. "But I think it's almost like he's gone back to being Richard Gere again, like a stranger. Like a stranger." The man who had desperately sought a profound connection with the universe was entirely incapable of maintaining a profound connection in his own living room. The marriage had been a beautiful, exhausting, and ultimately failed experiment. But as Richard Gere was signing the divorce papers, sitting in the quiet wreckage of his personal life, a spectacular, almost cruel irony was unfolding in movie theaters across the globe. Just as his real-life romance was violently fracturing, he had starred in a movie about an emotionally detached, wealthy businessman who hires an escort, only to realize that her raw, authentic spirit is the very thing that can rescue his frozen heart. The movie was Pretty Woman. It grossed $463 million worldwide. It became the definitive, ultimate romantic fantasy of the 20th century. The entire planet was falling in love with Richard Gere exactly at the very moment he was discovering that he did not actually know how to make love work in reality. He was a king of romance on the silver screen and a complete, agonizing stranger to the woman who used to share his bed. The paradox was complete. The illusion was total. And as the 1990s marched toward a close, Richard Gere found himself entirely alone once again. But he was about to discover that his most profound, life-altering chapter of love was still waiting for him, decades down the road, disguised as a quiet, unexpected redemption. The Exile, the First Son, and the Collision of Worlds. There is a profound, incredibly liberating power in finally accepting the consequences of your own convictions. When Richard Gere stood on the stage at the 1993 Academy Awards and chose his conscience over his career, he detonated a bridge that could never, ever be rebuilt. The aftermath was swift, silent, and absolute. As the new millennium approached, the global cinematic landscape had permanently shifted. The Chinese box office was no longer just an emerging market. It was a vital, beating heart of international film revenue. Major studios simply could not afford the geopolitical risk of casting a man who had publicly humiliated the Chinese government. Richard Gere was effectively exiled from the mainstream Hollywood machinery. The massive $100 million franchise roles vanished. The phones in his agent's office stopped ringing with blockbuster offers. He was a global icon who had been quietly, systematically erased from the very industry he helped build. But for a man who spent hours every single morning meditating on the impermanence of material wealth and the illusion of the ego, this exile was not a punishment. It was a clearing of the stage. Lesser men might have apologized. They might have walked back their statements, hired a crisis management team, and played the corporate game to regain their status. But Richard embraced his exile with a terrifying, absolute calm. "I don't regret it for a second," he stated flatly, reflecting on the blacklisting. "The Dalai Lama asked me to help, and that's more important than any movie role. Major studios wouldn't touch me. They'd be polite about it, of course, but the message was clear." Shut out of the massive, sanitized studio system, Richard turned his attention to the gritty, nuanced, and infinitely more complicated world of independent cinema. And in a beautiful, poetic twist of fate, the very exile that was meant to destroy his career actually salvaged his art. Free from the pressure of maintaining his sex symbol brand, Richard began delivering the absolute best, most complex performances of his entire life. Films like Arbitrage in 2012 showcased a depth and moral ambiguity that blockbusters rarely allowed. As corrupt billionaire Robert Miller, he delivered an explosive, massive performance that earned him a Golden Globe nomination, reminding the cynical critics that beneath the handsome leading man was a ferociously talented actor who had been waiting decades for material worthy of his intellect. But as his artistic life found a renewed, quieter purpose in the shadows, his personal life was about to undergo a profound, earth-shattering resurrection. In the late 1990s, the dust from his highly publicized, painful divorce from Cindy Crawford had finally settled. Richard was approaching his 50th birthday, seeking something far more substantial than the superficial chaos of a Hollywood romance. He met Carrie Lowell, a fiercely intelligent actress and former Bond girl who had appeared in License to Kill. Carrie was 15 years his junior, but unlike his previous marriage, this relationship was not built on the intoxicating, unstable foundation of celebrity worship. Carrie was grounded, mature, and deeply respectful of quiet, introspective life Richard was trying to build. For a brief, beautiful window of time, it seemed that the restless seeker had finally found his anchor. On February 6, 2000, at the age of 50, Richard Gere experienced the most profound, reality-altering moment of his entire existence. Carrie gave birth to their son, Homer James Jigme Gere. The middle name, Jigme, was a Tibetan word meaning fearless, chosen specifically with the blessing of the Dalai Lama. For a man who had spent half a century traveling the world, seeking enlightenment in ancient monasteries, and dominating the global box office, the birth of his son completely dismantled every single philosophy he had ever studied. "Everything changed," Richard said quietly, his voice carrying the heavy, awestruck reverence of a new father. You think you understand love, and then you hold your child. You think you understand love, and then you hold your child. Listen to the absolute, shattering humility in those words. For the older audiences watching this, especially the fathers and grandfathers who remember the exact, terrifying, magnificent weight of holding their firstborn child. That realization is universal. The man who had been searching the cosmos for meaning suddenly found the entire universe staring back at him from a crib. Richard and Carrie were officially married in 2002. They built a quiet, intensely private life away from the flashing cameras. They raised Homer with a fierce dedication to normalcy. Richard was a profoundly present father, prioritizing his son's baseball games and school events over industry galas. It was an era of genuine, hard-won peace. He had his family. He had his spiritual practice. He had his independent films. But the fundamental, unyielding tragedy of Richard Gere's life is that he is a man constantly pulled between two entirely incompatible dimensions. He was a husband and a father living in the material world of New York and Hollywood, but his soul was permanently residing in the quiet, ascetic monasteries of the Himalayas. As the years stretched into a decade, the massive, invisible friction between his spiritual devotions and the mundane, daily requirements of traditional marriage began to quietly tear the foundation of their home apart. Richard's commitment to Tibetan Buddhism was not a casual hobby. It was the absolute, non-negotiable center of his existence. His mornings began with hours of solitary, intense meditation. He would frequently disappear for weeks at a time on silent, rigorous spiritual retreats. His closest advisor, his true confidant, was a Tibetan monk, not a Hollywood agent, and perhaps most painfully, not always his wife. Practice was always my real life, Richard had once confessed, brutally outlining the hierarchy of his heart. For Carrie Lowell, a vibrant, intelligent woman who had built a life with this man, the reality of being married to a devout, uncompromising seeker became incredibly isolating. She, like Cindy before her, found herself constantly competing for his attention. But she wasn't competing with another woman. She was competing with a religion. She was competing with a level of spiritual detachment that inherently minimizes the importance of worldly attachments, including marriage itself. It is an incredibly painful, complex dynamic to navigate. How do you argue with a husband who responds to marital frustration with Zen detachment? How do you build a fiery, passionate partnership with a man who is actively trying to extinguish the flames of human ego and desire? The agonizing truth is that you cannot. By 2013, after 11 years of marriage, the silence in their massive estate had grown unbearable. Carrie Lowell officially filed for divorce. The proceedings were long, painful, and deeply complicated by the division of their immense assets, ultimately finalizing in 2016. The court documents vaguely cited lifestyle differences, but those who understood the deep, internal mechanics of Richard's soul knew the exact truth. The man who had survived the brutal exile of the Hollywood studio system had failed to survive the quiet, suffocating distance within his own living room. The divorce left Richard with shared custody of his beloved son, Homer, and a deep, profound well of regret. He was 67 years old. He had survived 2 massive, highly publicized marriages. He had built a legacy of incredible activism and artistic integrity. But as he sat alone in the quiet, echoing rooms of his life, meditating on the impermanence of all things, he was forced to confront a terrifying possibility. Perhaps a man who dedicates his entire life to finding absolute spiritual enlightenment is simply incompatible with the messy, demanding, and beautiful reality of a traditional family. He had chosen his principles over his career. He had chosen his practice over his marriages. He had accepted the loneliness of the path he was walking. But the universe, operating with its magnificent, wildly unpredictable sense of humor, was not entirely finished with the aging bodhisattva. Just as Richard Gere had finally, completely accepted that he was destined to walk the rest of his journey entirely alone, the most unexpected, logic-defying, and profound chapter of his entire life was waiting for him. quietly disguised in the form of a 31-year-old Spanish activist. The exile was about to end, and the most terrifying, beautiful mathematics of human mortality were about to begin. The mortality math, the Spanish soulmate, and the race against time. There's a widely accepted, deeply comforting narrative about the autumn of human existence. Society tells us that by the time a man reaches his mid-60s, the architecture of his life is permanently settled. The turbulent, agonizing searches for identity, for purpose, and for ultimate romantic love are supposed to be firmly in the rear-view mirror. You are expected to gracefully step back, enjoy the silence of your estate, and watch the younger generation inherit the earth. By 2014, Richard Gere was 65 years old. He had survived the punishing, superficial meat grinder of the Hollywood studio system. He had endured the agonizing, highly publicized collapses of 2 marriages. He had proudly accepted his industry exile to protect his Tibetan Buddhist principles. His eldest son, Homer, was navigating his own teenage years. The script of Richard's life appeared to be entirely, beautifully finished. But the universe, operating with its magnificent, completely unpredictable sense of poetry, was simply clearing the stage for the most profound, life-altering act of his entire existence. He was about to fall in love again. But this time, it was not going to be a Hollywood fairy tale. It was going to be a spiritual collision. Her name was Alejandra Silva. She was a Spanish publicist and a fiercely dedicated human rights activist. She was 31 years old. In the ruthless, cynical arena of tabloid journalism, a 33-year age gap between a wealthy, aging Hollywood leading man and a beautiful, young European woman is immediately, maliciously categorized as a midlife cliché. The media eagerly prepared to write another story about an aging actor desperately trying to recapture his fading youth. But when Richard and Alejandra looked at each other, they completely bypassed the superficial arithmetic of their birth years. They recognized a shared, profound frequency. Alejandra was not a 22-year-old girl eager to mold her personality around a superstar, as Cindy Crawford had admittedly done decades prior. Nor was she a woman forced to compete with Richard's intense, demanding religious practices, as Carrie Lowell had experienced. Alejandra matched his spiritual intensity step for step. They shared a burning, uncompromising dedication to humanitarian activism. They viewed the world through the exact same lens of compassion and service. "We are like soulmates," Alejandra would later say, describing the instantaneous, unbreakable gravity of their bond. "We have the same values. We see the world in the same way. From the first moment, we felt that we had known each other for a long time." They did not rush. They dated quietly, away from the blinding flashbulbs of Los Angeles. They traveled to remote sanctuaries. They meditated together. And in 2018, they were married in a deeply private, spiritually grounded ceremony. There was no aluminum foil ring. There was no desperate need to prove anything to the public. There was only a profound, quiet partnership. And then, the universe handed the aging bodhisattva a miracle that would completely, fundamentally rewrite the very definition of his mortality. In February 2019, at the astonishing age of 69, Richard Gere became a father again. Alejandra gave birth to their son, Alexander. And just 14 months later, in April 2020, as the entire globe was plunging into the terrifying, isolating grip of a global pandemic, the 70-year-old icon welcomed another son, James. Richard Gere was 70 years old, with 2 children under the age of 2. For the audiences watching this, especially the men who remember the sheer, bone-deep physical exhaustion of chasing toddlers around a living room in their 20s and 30s, the physical reality of parenting 2 infants at the age of 70 is almost incomprehensible. But for Richard, the man who had once commanded $20 million a film, the man who had meditated in the freezing Himalayas to extinguish his earthly attachments, the absolute center of his universe was suddenly reduced to building Lego towers and warming up milk. The restlessness that haunted his entire life simply evaporated. My priorities changed completely, he said softly, looking back at the overwhelming, terrifying beauty of his late-in-life fatherhood. My world suddenly wasn't about films or awards or anything else. It was about them. People ask if I'm too old to be a father, but I think I'm finally the right age. I can give these boys something I couldn't give before. Absolute presence. I can give these boys absolute presence. Listen to the magnificent, hard-earned wisdom in that sentence. He traded the golden cage of Hollywood for the chaotic, beautiful, messy reality of a playroom floor. But within this profound, unexpected joy, a dark, terrifying, and inescapable psychological shadow began to aggressively gather in the corners of his mind. When a man has children at the age of 70, he is forced to confront a brutal, mathematically unforgiving reality. He cannot rely on the comfortable illusion that he has decades left to watch them grow. Every single birthday, every single milestone is accompanied by the heavy, silent ticking of a biological clock. Richard found himself obsessively calculating the agonizing math of his own mortality. If he lived to be 85, his young boys would only be 15 years old. They would still be in high school. They would have to navigate the complex, terrifying transition into manhood without their father to guide them. He began to carry the incredibly heavy, heartbreaking fear that if he crossed the threshold too soon, Alexander and James might only know him as a faded photograph on a mantle or as a character in an old movie. They might never actually remember the warmth of his hands or the sound of his voice. And in February of 2023, that quiet, philosophical fear suddenly, violently transformed into a catastrophic medical emergency. Richard was on vacation with his family in Nuevo Vallarta, Mexico, celebrating Alejandra's 40th birthday. What began as a seemingly harmless, persistent cough rapidly, aggressively escalated. His lungs began to fill with fluid. He was struggling to pull oxygen into his body. At 73 years old, the situation shifted from an inconvenience to a 5-alarm life-or-death crisis. He was rushed to a local Mexican hospital and diagnosed with severe, potentially fatal case of pneumonia. To understand the absolute, unadulterated terror of that hospital room, you must strip away the legacy of the movie star. Laying in that hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and struggling to breathe, Richard Gere was not the American Gigolo. He was not the fearless activist who fought the Chinese government. He was a 73-year-old father, looking into the terrified eyes of his young wife, realizing that the invisible, silent thief he had been fearing for 4 years had finally arrived to collect its debt. When a man lies on the precipice between this world and the next, the trivialities of his life are instantly burned away. In those agonizing, feverish days in a hospital, Richard did not think about the Academy Awards he never won. He did not think about the millions of dollars he had donated. "I thought about the boys constantly," he later admitted, his voice carrying the raw, bleeding vulnerability of a man who had looked directly into the abyss. "Not my career, not my legacy, just whether I get to see them grow up. Just whether I get to see them grow up." For every parent or grandparent watching this, that sentence strikes a nerve so incredibly deep, so fundamentally primal, that it takes your breath away. It is the ultimate, universal terror of outliving your physical ability to protect the fragile lives you brought into the world. Against the terrifying odds of his age and the severity of the infection, the universe decided that Richard's time had not yet expired. With the fierce, uncompromising advocacy of Alejandra by his side, he slowly stabilized. He survived the pneumonia. He was discharged from a hospital and returned to his family. But he returned as a fundamentally, permanently altered man. He had survived the physical storm, but the psychological impact of staring down his own mortality created a desperate, beautiful urgency within his soul. He realized that time was not a guarantee. It was a rapidly evaporating luxury. He began an incredibly moving, heartbreaking project. He started recording videos of himself reading bedtime stories, documenting family traditions, and writing letters that his boys could open at their 16th birthdays, their graduations, and their weddings. He was meticulously, desperately bottling his own voice, his own wisdom, and his own love, ensuring that even if his physical body failed him, his spirit would never, ever leave their side. He had spent his entire youth trying to figure out how to be an immortal movie star. And now, in his mid-70s, he was spending every ounce of his remaining energy trying to figure out how to be an immortal father. But as he recovered in the United States, surrounded by his beautiful, chaotic, bicultural family, a quiet realization began to settle over him. Hollywood was entirely in his rearview mirror. The aggressive, noisy, and politically fractured landscape of America was no longer the environment where he wanted his young boys to grow up. The man who had spent 50 years searching for the perfect sanctuary was about to make one final, monumental decision. He was about to pack up his entire multi-million-dollar American empire, say a final, quiet goodbye to the country that made him a legend, and cross the ocean to find the absolute, ultimate anonymity he had been seeking since he was a confused, philosophy-reading teenager in Syracuse. The Exile's return, the Madrid sanctuary, and the ultimate liberation. There's a profound, almost terrifying addiction embedded within the American dream. We are taught that accumulation is the ultimate metric of a successful life. We spend decades gathering titles, acquiring massive estates, collecting luxury cars, and fiercely protecting our relevance, terrified that if we let go of our possessions, we will somehow cease to exist. For the vast majority of Hollywood legends, the final act of their lives is spent desperately clinging to the throne. They refuse to step out of the spotlight. They surround themselves with the towering, heavy monuments of their own wealth. But Richard Gere is not a man who has ever been bound by the illusions of the material world. As he recovered from the terrifying brush with death in Mexico, and as he watched his two young sons, Alexander and James, growing up in a fractured, deeply polarized, and hyper-anxious America, the 75-year-old patriarch realized that it was time to execute the final, most brilliant disappearing act of his entire career. He was going to give it all away. In the late autumn of 2024, Richard made a decision that barely registered a blip on the radar of mainstream Hollywood gossip, but represented an absolute, staggering philosophical triumph for the man himself. He quietly, methodically packed up his American empire. He sold his magnificent, deeply beloved equestrian estate in Connecticut for nearly $11 million. The sprawling, $24 million oceanfront property in Malibu, the stunning estates, the collection of over 20 vintage supercars, Ferraris, Aston Martins, a Bugatti Veyron, all that was left behind to gather dust or be sold. The private jets were grounded. He looked at the $120 million fortune he had spent 50 years accumulating in the brutal trenches of the entertainment industry, and he simply walked away. He packed up his family, Alejandra, their two young boys, and Alejandra's teenage son, Albert, and he moved across the Atlantic Ocean, relocating permanently to the vibrant, ancient, and deeply cultured streets of Madrid, Spain. When asked by perplexed journalists why he would abandon the absolute pinnacle of American luxury to start over in a foreign country in his mid-70s, Richard delivered an answer that entirely dismantled the selfish, ego-driven mythology of the Hollywood leading man. "I love Spain. I love Madrid," Richard explained with a soft, incredibly peaceful smile. "But it's time for my wife to be around her family and friends and culture. She gave up a lot to live in my world for years. Now, it is my turn to live in hers. If she is happy, I am happy. If she is happy, I am happy." Listen to the breathtaking, absolute surrender in that sentence. It is perhaps the most profoundly Buddhist statement he has ever made in his entire life. It is a complete dissolution of the self. The man who was once the center of the cinematic universe willingly, joyfully erased his own ego for the sake of the woman he loves. Today, in the year 2026, Richard Gere is 76 years old. In Madrid, he has discovered a treasure that all the billions of dollars in California could never, ever buy him: absolute anonymity. In the bustling, sun-drenched plazas of his new home, he is no longer the American Gigolo. He is no longer the defiant activist banned by China. He is no longer the global sex symbol. He is simply Ricardo, the silver-haired, aging American who lives down the street. He walks his young boys to school holding their tiny hands. He shops at the local markets, practicing his Spanish with patient shopkeepers who politely pretend not to know who he is. His mornings do not begin with frantic calls from agents offering franchise roles. His mornings begin with the beautiful, chaotic tyranny of toddlers, burnt pancakes, scattered toys, and the laughter of children who do not care that their father was once the most desired man on the planet. They just wanted to play on the floor. "I don't need to be everywhere anymore," Richard recently confessed, his gravelly voice thick with profound, unshakable contentment. "I've stopped caring about things. They don't bring happiness. They never did. I just want to be there when my boys laugh." As he watches his eldest son, Homer, who is now 26, navigate his own burgeoning acting career back in America, Richard offers the quiet, hard-earned caution of a man who survived a fire. But for his two youngest boys, Richard is meticulously engineering a completely different kind of inheritance. He has already drafted his estate planning, and the details are a stunning testament to his lifelong principles. The vast majority of his massive fortune will not be handed down to his children in the form of trust funds. Instead, it will flow directly into his philanthropic foundations. It will support children's health care, scholarships for disadvantaged youth, and the preservation of Tibetan culture. "I don't want my sons to inherit money," Richard stated with an absolute, unwavering firmness. "I want them to inherit values. I want children who begin with nothing to inherit the chances I was lucky enough to have." What a magnificent, staggering definition of true legacy. When we step back and look at the absolute totality of Richard Gere's 76 years on Earth, the poetic symmetry of his life comes into perfect, breathtaking focus. Remember the restless, incredibly talented 20-year-old boy in Syracuse, the kid who dropped out of college, carrying Jean-Paul Sartre's books under his arm, agonizing over the meaning of human existence. He locked himself in a cramped New York apartment, sitting in silence for months, desperately searching for the answer to the ultimate question: what is this all for? He spent half a century searching for the answer. He looked for it in the blinding flashbulbs of Hollywood premieres. He looked for it in the arms of supermodels. He looked for it while standing on the stage of the Academy Awards, risking his entire career to speak truth to power. He traveled to the freezing peaks of the Himalayas to ask the Dalai Lama. But the answer was not on a movie screen. It was not in a bank account. And it was not in a monastery. The answer was waiting for him at a messy breakfast table in Madrid. The boy from Syracuse finally found his enlightenment, not by escaping the world, but by fully, completely surrendering to the unconditional love of a family. He traded box office glory for bedtime stories. He sacrificed his career for his conscience. He successfully navigated the most toxic, superficial industry in the history of human civilization, and he walked out the other side with his soul entirely intact. Richard Gere did not just play an officer and a gentleman. He became one. And as he sits on a quiet Spanish balcony, holding his wife's hand, watching the sun set over a life lived entirely on his own uncompromising terms, the exile is finally over. The restless seeker has finally arrived exactly where he was always meant to be. He is finally, unequivocally, home. As Richard Gere's journey reminds us, the greatest peace isn't found in what we gather, but in what we are finally willing to let go of. True wealth is measured in moments, not millions. What about you, as you navigate the changing seasons of life? What golden cages have you walked away from to protect your peace? Please share your hard-earned wisdom in the comments below. If the story of choosing truth over fame moved you, please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories behind the legends. Thank you for your time, and until next time, keep searching for your own peace.